Close your eyes and imagine a quiet street in Memphis, Tennessee, in the early 1940s. The afternoon sun tilts low, painting the wooden porches in amber light. A little girl with curious eyes sits on the steps of a modest house on Lucy Avenue. Her name is Aretha. The air smells of warm earth and magnolia blossoms. Inside, her father, the Reverend C.L. Franklin, hums a gospel tune while he irons his Sunday shirt. The gentle rhythm of the ironing board creaks like a heartbeat. Little Aretha listens. Music is already a member of the family, as present as the tick of the mantel clock. Not long after, the family moves north to Detroit, Michigan. The city there feels bigger, full of wide streets and towering elm trees. They settle into a large brick house on LaSalle Boulevard. The new home quickly fills with voices. Reverend Franklin becomes the pastor of New Bethel Baptist Church, and the family's living room often welcomes traveling gospel singers. Aretha, now 6 years old, watches these visitors with wide eyes. She studies the way they hold their bodies when they sing, the slight close of the eyelids, the deep breath before the first note. The golden light from the front window catches the dust motes dancing in the air while Mahalia Jackson's laugh rolls through the room. That rich, honeyed sound plants a seed in the girl's chest. Sunday morning at New Bethel Baptist is a world of its own. The red brick building stands solid on the corner, and by 10 o'clock, the pews are filled with families dressed in their finest. The stained glass windows cast pools of blue, gold, and ruby onto the wooden floor. Aretha sits in the front row, her patent leather shoes swinging just above the ground. She feels the low rumble of the organ beneath her feet before it even fills the air. The choir sways behind her father, who delivers his sermon with a voice that rises and falls like a summer storm. In that sacred space, surrounded by hats with silk flowers and the faint scent of hymnal pages, Aretha learns how sound can lift a room. It can turn worry into something lighter, like sunlight through colored glass. The piano in the church basement becomes her first real friend. On quiet afternoons, while her mother, Barbara Siggers Franklin, straightens the choir robes upstairs, Aretha sits on the worn bench. Her small fingers find the keys by ear, picking out the melody of Jesus Be a Fence. The basement is cool and smells of floor wax and old wood. One bare bulb hangs overhead. She doesn't read music yet. She listens to the shape of a song and lets it pour back out through her hands. She plays with an instinct that surprises even her father. The notes bounce off the cinderblock walls and rise up through the floorboards, where someone passing by might pause and think, for a moment, that angels are rehearsing underground. When Aretha is only 10 years old, her mother passes away. The loss moves through the house on LaSalle Boulevard like a long, slow shadow. For many days, Aretha sits on the edge of her bed and watches the lace curtains stir in the breeze. The house is quieter now. Her father brings home a record player and a stack of gospel records. In the living room, she listens to Clara Ward and the famous Ward singers, the vinyl crackling softly like a fireplace. The voices wrap around her like a familiar blanket. Through that music, she finds a way to breathe again. The sorrow does not disappear, but it softens, finding a home deep in the texture of her future voice, a place where pain and beauty will live side by side. Before long, Aretha steps up to the microphone in her father's church, her small frame barely visible over the pulpit. The congregation falls silent. The chandeliers above glow like a crown of candles. With her father at the piano, she opens her mouth and sings "Never Grow Old." It's a simple melody, but what comes out is a sound not quite girl, not quite woman, something timeless. People in the back row lean forward. Women press handkerchiefs to their lips. The stained glass windows seem to vibrate with the purity of the tone. That first public song lasts only a few minutes, but it lays a foundation. In that moment, the congregation understands. This quiet girl from the front pew has been chosen by something far beyond them. Outside, the Detroit afternoon goes on, the elm trees swaying gently, cars passing on the boulevard, and inside, a future queen stands in the hushed light. When she is not singing at church, young Aretha rides the streetcar along Woodward Avenue. She watches the shop windows glide by, their displays of hats and gloves glittering under the marquee lights. The early 1950s city moves around her, men in fedoras, women in swing coats, the smell of roasted peanuts from a street cart. She loves to observe the quiet dramas of daily life, a woman fixing her stocking in a doorway, a boy on a bicycle tossing newspapers onto porches. These small moments teach her about human feeling. Later, when she sings a love song or a cry for justice, she will draw on the memory of that streetcar window, where the world outside looked both distant and intimately close. The Ordinary is a school for the soul, and she is an eager student. As darkness falls over Detroit, the Franklin house settles into its evening rhythm. Aretha's older sister Irma practices a piano piece in the parlor, the melody drifting up the staircase. Their father, sitting in his armchair, reads the evening paper under a standing lamp. Aretha climbs the stairs slowly, her hand sliding along the polished banister. She pauses at the small window on the landing, where she can see the lights of the city flickering like a field of quiet fire. She is 12 years old, and the world is changing. But right now, there is only the sound of her own breathing and the faint gospel tune Irma is still playing downstairs. The notes follow her into her room and tuck themselves beneath her pillow as she closes her eyes. A voice is growing inside her, dreaming. In the soft morning light of her 13th birthday, Aretha wakes earlier than the rest of the house. She puts on a simple dress and walks to New Bethel Baptist alone. The sanctuary is empty, dark except for the sun pushing through the eastern window. She sits at the piano and places her fingers on the keys without making a sound. Outside, a milk truck clatters down the street. Aretha begins to play, very softly, a hymn she heard her mother hum. The notes fill the hollow space like water filling a basin. She doesn't know it yet, but she is practicing for a lifetime of early mornings just like this one, quiet hours spent in empty halls, learning how to turn an unseen ache into a sound that could heal. In the gentle Detroit dawn, the church holds its breath, and a young girl hums the first lines of her own story. The Franklin house on LaSalle Boulevard awakens slowly each morning. In the kitchen, the percolator bubbles a coffee rhythm as the first pale light slips through the curtain. Aretha, now 15, moves through the hallway in her robe, her hair pinned up for the day. The house carries the scent of fresh biscuits and the light polish her father uses on his shoes. Irma and Carolyn, her sisters, chatter softly as they set the breakfast table. Outside, a dog barks in a neighbor's yard, and the distant sound of a factory whistle floats across the city. This is the music of ordinary love, plates clinking, a toast popping up, someone humming a snatch of last night's radio tune. It is in these everyday moments that Aretha learns the depth of family harmony. School at Northern High brings its own quieter music. Aretha walks the long hallways lined with metal lockers, the late autumn sun cutting through the tall windows and landing in rectangles on the floor. She is a shy girl, not one to call attention to herself. But when she sits at the piano in the music room during recess, a small crowd often gathers. She plays by ear, pulling melodies from the air like they have always belonged to her. The music teacher, Mrs. Doss, stands by the door and listens, her hand resting on her heart. Aretha's playing is not loud, it is an invitation. The room, filled with the smell of chalk dust and old sheet music, becomes a sanctuary where teenagers can forget algebra and simply feel. In this space, a talent as wide as a lake stays mostly hidden, a treasure known only to a few. Afternoons back at home are a slow, golden chapter. Aretha often sits in the screened porch, a glass of lemonade sweating on the arm of the wicker chair. The elm trees toss their shadows across the lawn. She writes in a small notebook, not exactly lyrics yet, but lines that feel like songs. A phrase about the way light hits a windowsill, a thought about longing that she can't quite name. The neighborhood children play a game of tag 2 houses down, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Detroit in the 1950s is a city of broad avenues and moderate dreams. Aretha watches the mailman make his rounds, his leather bag slung across his shoulder, his steps deliberate and calm. There is a quiet dignity in his movement that she admires. He will appear again, decades later, in a place in her memory, when she sings about respect. One evening each week, the parlor transforms into a small concert hall. Reverend Franklin invites musicians who are passing through town to come and play. The velvet drapes are drawn and the lamps are turned low. A pianist named James Cleveland might sit at the upright and let his fingers roam. Aretha, squeezed onto the sofa between her sisters, watches the keys blur under his hands. The room fills with a slow gospel blues, a sound that seems to rise from the floorboards. Her father closes his eyes and sways. The visitors sip sweet tea from glass cups. Outside the window, the street is dark and silent. Inside, a sacred sound swells. Aretha is not just a listener. She is a student of every subtle gesture, the way a singer leans into a microphone, the tiny pause before a high note. These living room concerts are her real conservatory. Traveling with her father on gospel tours becomes a part of her rhythm. They drive the long highways south in a comfortable sedan, the countryside unspooling past the windows like a continuous quilt of farms and pine stands. Aretha rests her head against the seat and watches telephone poles march by. At night, they stay in modest motor courts, the neon sign buzzing outside the room. In the morning, Aretha helps her father straighten his tie before they walk into a small wooden church in Alabama or Georgia. She sees the same stained glass, the same hopeful faces, but each congregation has its own accent, its own way of saying amen. She absorbs these differences like a traveler gathering stones. At a roadside diner, she pours cream into her coffee and listens to a jukebox playing Ray Charles. Every mile, every meal, weaves itself into the woman she is becoming. When she is 17, Aretha steps into a recording studio for the first time. It is a small space in Detroit with soundproofed walls that smell of dust and burnt coffee. A single microphone stands in the center of the room like a metal flower. She takes a breath and leans into it. The engineer, an older man with glasses low on his nose, watches through a glass window. Her father is there, standing quietly in the corner. Aretha sings a simple hymn, her voice still full of the Sunday morning air. The tape reels turn. In the control room, the engineer turns to the Reverend and says, "This girl is something else." Outside, the cars on Gresham Avenue roll by, their headlights cutting through the early evening. The neighborhood goes about its business, unaware that a first note in an epic career has just been captured. Aretha removes the headphones and smiles, a little shy, a little proud. The world will not hear this recording for a few years, but something has clicked into place. Back home, the Franklin women gather in the kitchen on Saturday afternoons to cook. The table is covered in flour and the window over the sink is steamy from the boiling pots. Aretha peels apples, the long red strips curling into a bowl. Her grandmother tells stories of old Memphis, of hand-sewn quilts and river baptisms. The radio on the counter plays Dinah Washington. Aretha sings along absent-mindedly, her voice blending with the clatter of spoons and the hiss of the skillet. These are the hours that hold a family together. The love is not in grand speeches, but in the slice of butter melting on cornbread, the shared taste of a pot of greens. Aretha learns that a voice is not just for the stage, it is for the kitchen, for singing a little sister to sleep, for humming while you fold laundry. The music of home is the backbone music, the one nobody pays to hear, but everyone needs to survive. At night, in her small bedroom, Aretha lies in the dark with the window cracked open. The cool air carries the sound of a distant train, its horn a low, mournful note. She thinks about the road ahead. She is now 18, on the edge of a decision. A man named John Hammond from Columbia Records has heard about her. Her father has fielded phone calls, his voice careful and measured. Aretha stares at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of moonlight cast by the window screen. She pictures herself on a larger stage, not just the church pulpit, but a velvet curtain room in New York City. The thought is both thrilling and terrifying. But she remembers the basement piano, the streetcar window, the laughter of Mahalia Jackson in her own living room. All those moments are stepping stones. She closes her eyes. In the quiet, her breathing synchronizes with the distant train, and sleep arrives like a slow, steady rhythm. Tomorrow, a new dream will begin. New York City in the early 1960s arrives like a dream wrapped in steel and river mist. Aretha, now in her early 20s, steps out of a taxi on West 52nd Street, a thin scarf tied around her hair. The Columbia Records building rises before her, its entrance a revolving door of polished brass. She carries a small handbag and a folder of sheet music. The February wind nips at her cheeks, but the sky is a pale, clean blue, and the morning light falls in long stripes between the skyscrapers. She pauses for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the city breathe, men in overcoats, a flower seller arranging tulips, the distant sound of a saxophone drifting from an open upper window. This is a new kind of church, she thinks, a cathedral of ambition and sound, and she is ready to step inside. Inside the studio, the atmosphere is plush and deliberate. The walls are draped in heavy fabric, and the lighting is soft as candle glow. Aretha sits at a grand piano, its black surface shining like still water. John Hammond, the man who discovered Billie Holiday, stands nearby, his voice gentle and encouraging. He has heard something in Aretha's gospel-fired tone that he believes the world should know. The session musicians tune their instruments, the warm bass line, the quiet brush of a snare drum, the murmur of a horn section. Aretha places her fingers on the keys and begins to play a slow, elegant standard. It is not the music of her father's church. It is polished, urban, a little restrained. But underneath, in the grain of her voice, something raw and honest persists. The engineers in the control booth exchange glances. They know they have found a treasure, even if the map to it is still being drawn. During these Columbia years, Aretha lives in a small apartment on the Upper West Side. She walks the neighborhood in the late afternoon, often stopping at a little park where old men play chess on stone tables. The cherry trees are just beginning to bud. She sits on a bench and watches the light shift through the branches. The city noise is a distant hum, like a radio left on in another room. Sometimes she hums to herself, trying out melodies that will never be recorded. The world sees her on album covers, looking poised in satin gowns, but here, in the park, she is just a young woman in a wool coat, missing her family, missing the sound of her father's sermon, missing the easy laughter of the Sunday kitchen. She carries a notebook in which she writes not only tentative lyrics, but the names of birds she learns from a neighbor, cardinal, blue jay, the small sparrow that visits her fire escape. The recording sessions at Columbia are long and careful. One particular afternoon, they work on a ballad called Skylark. The studio is kept purposely cool to save the equipment from overheating. Aretha pulls a cardigan over her shoulders and takes her place at the microphone. She closes her eyes. In her mind, she is not in Manhattan at all. She is back in Detroit, sitting on the church basement bench, the one bare bulb hanging above her. She sings about a meadow in the mist, and her voice climbs and dips like a bird learning to trust the wind. The musicians follow her lead with almost reverent restraint. When the final note fades, there is a long silence. Then someone lets out a low whistle. It is not the hit that will define her, but it is a moment of pure artistry, a quiet statement that she is more than a gospel wunderkind. She is a painter of sound, learning a new palette. Away from the studio, Aretha often visits the Museum of Modern Art, which is just a short bus ride away. She stands before the large abstract canvases, fields of blue and yellow that seem to hum. On a particular Thursday afternoon, the gallery is nearly empty. She takes off her gloves one finger at a time and lets the silence of the room wrap around her. The paintings remind her of music, colors laid next to each other like notes in a chord. In the soft skylight, the dust in the air looks like tiny stars. She stays until a guard gently announces closing time, then steps back out onto 53rd Street, where the evening light has turned the buildings to copper. This habit of visiting museums will stay with her all her life. Visual beauty, she learns, feeds the inner ear. A quiet hour with a Monet or a Rothko can be as powerful as a session at the piano. During this period, Aretha also experiences the small, sweet domestic acts of independence. She learns to brew her own pot of tea, to shop for fresh vegetables at a corner market where the seller always calls her Miss Aretha. She presses her own dresses on a little ironing board set up in the living room. The iron hisses as she smooths the fabric, and the smell of clean cotton fills the room. Outside her window, the fire escapes of the city zigzag toward the sky. In the evening, she might read a Langston Hughes poem out loud to herself, letting the words roll around in her mouth. These ordinary moments are the foundation of a self. Before she will demand respect from the world, she must first learn to make a home with her own solitude. The quiet rhythm of domestic life steadies her, like the bass line in a slow-tempo song. In late 1963, on a rainy November afternoon, Aretha picks up a newspaper and reads about the March on Washington a few months earlier. Her father had stood near Dr. King. She thinks about the meaning of a voice lifted not just in song but in witness. That evening, she sits at the window of her apartment, watching the rain streak the glass. The street lamps below have halos of mist. She begins to sing, very softly, a spiritual she learned as a child, How I Got Over. Her voice fills the small room, not for anyone to hear, but for the city itself. The taxi cabs honk in the distance, but inside, a sacred stillness takes hold. She realizes that the music she wants to make must carry this feeling, the weight of a people's hope, the light of a rain-washed evening. The path ahead is becoming clearer. She needs to go deeper, to find a new kind of sound, one that doesn't smooth over the roughness of life, but lifts it up and sets it aglow. The seasons turn. Spring comes to Central Park, and Aretha walks along the reservoir. The water is a plate of silver. Joggers pass her, and a man flies a kite shaped like a butterfly. It is time for a change. The Columbia contract feels too tight, a beautiful cage. She has heard about a small label in the South, Atlantic Records, where raw soul is captured in warm, unpolished recordings. She stands at the water's edge and watches the ripples move. A decision forms, soft as the breeze. She will leave the skyscrapers behind, at least for a while, and go to the place where the earth is red and the music sweats. This realization does not come with a dramatic surge. It comes like a leaf falling onto still water, a gentle certainty. With a deep breath, she turns back toward the city, her footsteps quiet on the path, the great skyline standing behind her like a polite farewell.